Video games are one of the more recent mediums of entertainment to be introduced into our culture, behind social media. In 2021, it was estimated that around 3 billion people around the world play video games. And of that number, about 1.2 billion people play online multiplayer games. It's no question that the video game industry has probably become a permanent addition to human entertainment around the globe, perhaps even to the same degree of influence as the film industry and social media. And yet, despite this wide reach, increasing accessibility, and large audience, gaming subculture, and online gaming subculture in particular, has a, well, unique identity.
On race and video gaming. One study finding around 4 in 10 Americans personally experience some sort of harassment online, particularly.
Unfortunate.
Yeah, I think Mercy's not working out for you, dumb. Learn to play a proper character. 45 hours and you still suck. I guess girls just suck at video games in general. You stupid.
Wow.
And folks of color are there making themselves visible within the space. They are subject to a whole host of inequalities.
Slip smacking each other, you big
Never mind, man.
Get the out of here, you spook!
How can you hear this man cry for help and not offer services?
No, that's what I'm saying, bro. Like, damn, really doing him dirty.
Yo, isn't this cruel?
Dead ass.
We don't need 2 healers if we only have 5 players.
Yo, like, honestly, you don't have to bring your 2 cents in here. Just leave the voice chat again. You're not needed. Like, honestly.
It's hyper masculine. It's not real. It's a caricature of masculinity.
What? Is a talking to me? Is a female talking to me? Am I no? Am I tripping? Am I tripping? Or wait, come on. It's a female talking to me right now. It's a female talking to me. Get off the game and do your husband dishes. Shut up.
Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer were both sociologists who worked for the Frankfurt School. They coined the term the culture industry in their 1944 book, The Dialectic of the Enlightenment. The culture industry refers to how the products of culture that we create in a capitalist society have become intertwined with economic and profit-seeking interests. Adorno likened this reproduction of culture to a sort of factory in which every aspect of mass and pop culture were standardized and commodified, becoming objects of mindless leisure. They thought that this might lead to the general population being distracted from the exploitation that they're subjected to under capitalism. The main point of the concept of the culture industry is to kind of support and reaffirm the status quo, which is capitalism. One of Adorno and Horkheimer's most famous statements on the culture industry in their book is as follows. Amusement under late capitalism is the prolongation of work. What this means is that what we do to entertain ourselves ultimately serves the purpose of preserving the status quo. In this example, Adorno and Horkheimer used leisure activities after work to explain that leisure activities reinforce capitalism in that it keeps workers from burning out, and at the same time it also allows us to indulge in consumerism, be it through social media, TV, shopping, etc. So in doing leisure, which we do to get away from work, to cope with work, and to ultimately have the energy to go back to work, that itself is a part of the work cycle. It is not external to the goals of capitalism. But what does this have to do with gaming and toxicity as a whole? Part of the flexibility of using this framework is that it can be applied to all dominant aspects of our society, like, for example, hegemonic masculinity and patriarchy. Hegemonic masculinity defines the practices and systems which seek to legitimize male dominance and justify misogyny in a patriarchal society. Under this system is the idea of an idealized manhood that all men should strive to embody, a manhood that all masculinities have to position themselves in relation to, and a manhood that forms the peak of a hierarchy of masculinities that is subject to other intersections such as race, class, or background. To summarize a very complex topic, ideal masculinity under patriarchy in many ways boils down to having power over others. The result of this is the incentive for men to perform our culture's idea of ideal masculinity. Consequently, that performance requires a positioning of men in relation to other genders as superior. And within the hierarchy of masculinity, the positioning of white, cis men as superior to other races, sexualities, and social classes. It's important to note that hegemonic masculinity does not imply that all men behave in openly misogynistic or elitist behavior, but Connor and Messerschmitt state that hegemonic masculinity was not assumed to be normal in the statistical sense. Only a minority of men might enact it, but it was certainly normative. It embodied the currently most honored way of being a man, and it required all other men to position themselves in relation to it, and it ideologically legitimated the global subordination of women to men. So regardless of how you view and understand your own masculinity, it is always going to be understood in relation to the current ideal understanding of manhood, making all of us contributors or subject to this, to the patriarchy, to hegemonic masculinity. There are many, many studies that connect the performance of peak traditional masculinity with misogynistic ideologies and behaviors. Gender inequality, sexism, and misogyny in gaming stems from the fear of emasculation by women through poor performance. A study of Kasumovic and Kuznikov in 2015 showed that lower-skilled players were more hostile towards female-voiced teammates when performing poorly. The manosphere is an unavoidable topic when seeking to thoroughly dissect toxic masculinities and the reproduction of problematic behaviors. The manosphere is often described as the collection of creators, influencers, blogs, political commentators, and communities that perpetuate patriarchy and engage in misogynistic treatment and degradation of women. Those within this sphere often use the moniker alpha or signal male to describe their heightened masculine status, and betas to men who don't follow the manosphere's doctrines of strength, power dynamics, and misogyny. The manosphere is important when speaking on masculinities because currently it is the most dominant and widely accessible range of content that engages overtly with the topic of masculinity. This attracts men, mostly young men, who don't have sufficient support in their lives to be able to engage with their own masculinity healthily. A 2001 study on celebrity influence in young adults showed that as personal and emotional involvement in the celebrity increased, the more likely the individual was to emulate and conduct themselves like that celebrity. The pseudo-celebrity status of the influencers within the manosphere also pushes the image of ideal manhood onto their younger skewed audiences, reinforcing the expectations of men to strive to maintain traditional power relationships between women and to vilify and attack women, and sometimes other men, who challenge the maintenance of this power relationship. Men who may not be so comfortable and confident with their idea of masculinity react to and see these challenges as a direct attempt to emasculate them, and therefore overcompensate for their perceived lack of power and control in hypermasculine behavior, or the exaggeration of toxic masculine behaviors such as aggressiveness, misogyny, hate speech, and threats of violence. This behavior is much more explicit in online gaming. What follows is an overcompensatory performance of hypermasculinity as a defense mechanism for men who feel emasculated due to their lack of introspective framework to find healthier ways to cope with their own perceived failure of masculinity in relation to the manosphere and in relation to hegemonic masculinity. So, how does gaming toxicity and performative hypermasculinity relate to the culture industry as a whole, and why does that matter? There's a connection to be made about how the culture industry locks how we engage with cultural products like video games into maintaining the status quo. In the previous example about the work cycle and its connection to leisure, that status quo was capitalism. In a patriarchal society, men are expected to perpetuate traditional gender roles in order to maintain power over other genders and races. That is the work that is expected of this system. How men engage with video games, then, is the opportunity to cope with the exhaustion and failure of this expected performance of masculinity, which, in the lens of rhetoric surrounding the manosphere and a masculine hegemony, incites feelings of a loss of control and power. Video games, then, are a means of reclaiming that power in compensatory acts and behaviors of hyperaggression, misogyny, and racism. We should care about this because it allow this cycle of hypermasculinity, misogyny, racism, and homophobia to continue is to affirm and solidify those things as being necessary to the very nature of masculinity as a whole. Masculinity in reality is a spectrum and may mean many different things to many different people. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of education around how to challenge traditional gender roles for the demographics that need it, like exploratory teenagers or men who often like to game for leisure without the sufficient tools to deprogram the damage that toxic masculinity can cause. This makes it even easier for men to fall into alt-right communities and the manosphere, and makes it much easier for online video game communities to not be a relaxing and fun hobby, but instead to be a toxic, problematic space that continually participates in misogynistic, racist, homophobic rhetoric and behaviors.